Hey, my name is Matthew Ryan, Aussie author of the historical fiction series Till Time, and you're listening to There's a Time and a Place for That. Statistically, 56.1% of you are believers in the three Abrahamic faiths, a little less if we just take those who are fellow Australians. Whether you are or not, today's destination has had an outsized impact on global politics, both in the past and the present. We're about to visit a city revered by Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike, a place believed to be as old as 2.5 millennia at the time we're visiting. Countless armies have battled over this sacred site, hoping to bring glory to their God by possessing it or simply seeking the homes of their ancestors. So, say a prayer as we head on into Jerusalem 5 years after its bloodless capture by Salah al-Din, as the Third Crusade ends with an unexpected peace between the Christian and Muslim worlds. This is There's a Time and a Place for That, Episode 3, On Hallowed Ground, Part 1. Less than 100 years after its capture by Crusaders, it has fallen back into Islamic hands. Looking at the city of Jerusalem, however, we would not imagine it had only recently tipped back over the divide that seems to split the continents at the moment. Its walls are intact, no ruined buildings are visible, and the vibrating hum of conversation billows out from the city as if everything is business as normal. This is thanks largely to the honour and mercy of the warrior king al-Nazir Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Sultan of Egypt, Syria and Mecca, known to the West as Saladin. After taking Jerusalem without bloodshed 5 years ago, he has turned the city into an open site of pilgrimage for all believers. We are standing atop Mount Zion, just to the south of Jerusalem's walls, where King David defeated the Jebusites and established his citadel. Of course, this happened roughly 2200 years ago, and the city has been destroyed 4 times since then, one of which was mentioned in our tour through Rome. As such, it is unsurprising that the exact location of the Jebusite fortress has been lost to time. Nevertheless, the hill upon which we stand is currently known as Zion, and it is here that our tour begins. Before we pass through the walls of the city, there are a number of interesting sites right here, perched atop one of the outer hills of the range stretching out between the Dead Sea and the coastal plain to the west. The main site is the Church of St. Mary of Mount Zion, located at the place where the Virgin Mary ascended to heaven following her son's death. Just to note, nearly all of the churches in Jerusalem are dedicated to either of the two Marys, so by the time this podcast is over, I'm going to be sick of the name. Anyway, we see before us a 40-metre-long church made from sandy-coloured limestone with a long rectangular hall ending in a transept that protrudes from either side and a semicircular apse topped by a domed roof. Once, a Byzantine church, the Basilica of Hagia Sion, stood in its place, but it was destroyed over 500 years ago by the Sasanian Empire. Today, it serves as the home of the monastic order of the Abbey of Our Lady of Mount Zion, which will one day become part of the Jesuit order, but for now, the Ayyubid rulers allow these monks to remain. We can see some of them covered head to toe in simple black robes as they tend to the grounds of the church. To our right, as we slowly move in the direction of Jerusalem proper, is another building of great importance and simple construction. It is a cathedral, larger than the Lady of Zion's, and its significance began the day King David died. A dome rises up from the centre of this cross-shaped structure, while 3 square towers surround it, 2 at the front, 1 at the back. As we walk in through the front door, we can easily see how fresh and new the building is. Made from finely dressed limestone in the Gothic style that is all the rage in Europe, its tall arched windows and vaulted ceiling give the place an airy, almost heavenly vibe. At the far end of the church, which is used by Jews and Christians alike, is a large niche in the wall. Here, we can see a marble altar mimicking a stone coffin beneath a hexagonal cenotaph decorated with Hebrew letters and images of lions. This is the supposed resting place of King David himself. Of course, any actual tomb would be below ground, not least because of the millennia since his death, or the fact that Jerusalem has been razed several times, and this coffin is nothing more than a dedication to David. Nevertheless, it has proven a popular location for Old Testament-minded pilgrims to visit. Perhaps more interestingly, certainly to the Christians that ruled the city 5 years ago, is the wall on the other side of the altar. Taking up 2 aisles of the transept and enclosed by a wall is a room preserved from 11.5 centuries ago. Presumably. More likely, this cenacle, the room that held the Last Supper of the Bible, was built, or at the very least repaired, by crusaders. Columns topped with imagery of pelicans and fine glass windows surround a space that once held 120 of Jesus' disciples prior to his arrest, trial, and crucifixion. Very soon, this cathedral will be torn down, but the cenacle will remain all the way to the modern period. Leaving this truly ancient cathedral behind, we begin walking along the scrubby hill towards the Zion Gate of Jerusalem. Far from the dry, desert-like environment we perhaps expected from modern media, Jerusalem has an abundance of vibrant green trees, mainly cypresses and palms, that offer cool shade to its citizens, though there is still little grass underfoot and only a scattering of low bushes. The walls of Jerusalem, a couple of meters thick and 12 meters tall, rise up before us, pierced directly ahead by a rectangular gate surrounded by a carved arch-like indent. This gate, the Bab Sayun, or Bab Harat al-Yahud in Arabic, leads directly into the Jewish quarter of the city. This district is not named due to any real segregation of Jerusalem's population, only that there are more Jews here than in any other parts of the city. Similarly, the quarter just to the west, the Armenian quarter, is just the area that the Armenians mostly live in. Modern Armenia, in this late 12th century, is part of the Kingdom of Georgia. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Armenia and the Armenian Principality of Cilicia occupy the eastern quarter of modern Turkey. As we walk into the city proper, the dense sprawl of tight streets and multi-story buildings ahead, we will take a left and make our way towards the large domed cathedral that serves as the heart of the Armenian quarter. Dedicated to the 2 apostles named James, one of whom was actually Jesus' brother, or probably a cousin or something, this church of St. James, whatever. It is another monastery, but one far larger than the abbey outside the walls, and it and the suburb around it are inhabited instead by Armenian Christians. Armenia was actually the first Christian nation in the world, with King Tridaites the Great converting in 301 CE, a full 12 years before Constantine the Great would essentially do the same to Rome. Their style of Christianity, however, differs from those of Europe, as the Armenians tend to believe that Jesus was fully divine, rather than being of a dual nature. The monastery takes up a large proportion of the quarter, and is the home of the Armenian Apostolic Church's Jerusalem Patriarchate, which is kind of like an archbishopric. As we come close, the first building of this monastic complex rises up before us, emerging from the twisting streets to be surrounded by a far more open, garden-like space. Built in the tetraconch style common to Armenia, with a square side rising up 2 stories, and a triangular-topped 3rd story coming up in the center that is repeated on each of the 4 sides, this is the Church of the Holy Archangels. 2 rows of arched windows ring the sides, while the central, higher section of each side has a large round window to allow light to spread out across the congregation within. At the very center of this church is a dome, built in the same volcanic stone as the rest of the building. Most of Jerusalem is built of one of 2 materials. Limestone is preferred by Europeans, and the majority of the recent Christian buildings are made from them, whereas Muslims and locals use the more readily available clay to bake into bricks for their buildings. Armenians, however, have easier access to volcanic stone than either limestone or clay, and they have imported their preferred building material from their homeland. Of course, larger and fancier places in Jerusalem will be done up in marble, gold, and colourful mosaics, but for this 16-metre tall by 16-metre wide church, the simple brickwork gives it a humble, authentic look. It is here that, according to the Gospel John, Jesus was questioned by Annas, the father-in-law to the high priest of the Jews, Caiaphas, though the other Gospels tell that it was Caiaphas himself who was responsible for his questioning, after which he was sent to Pontius Pilate for sentencing. Past here, we come to the sprawling compound of the monastery proper, which houses the Armenian Patriarch, as well as the many monks and priests who serve God here in Jerusalem. Many of the buildings here are dormitories, seminaries for training priests, scriptoria, which hold several thousand Armenian Christian scrolls dating back to late antiquity, smaller chapels for private contemplation, and the medieval equivalent of hospitals, where monks would treat the sick and wounded, all surrounding a large 60-metre-long courtyard. Other places nearby feature the large population of Armenian merchants and artisans who take the unique creations and goods of the highlands far to the north and bring them to the lands of Palestine. Despite its small size, the Armenian quarter was recently reinforced by over 1,000 immigrants coming from Armenia and Cilicia, and this area of Jerusalem now thrums with activity and life. On our left, as we turn north up the street running the length of the quarter, the houses of the city give way for an open public park, injecting a spot of greenery in the otherwise crowded city. As we take in the crisp, wintry air, we come upon the largest single building in the Armenian quarter. Sitting at the center of the monastery, we spied the domed ceiling of this basilica as we enter through the Zion Gate. This is the Church of St. James. As we walk through its front doors, between the suspended planks of wood that serve as bells for calling people to church, we can see that it greatly resembles the basilicas of the Byzantines, the greatest example of which is the Hagia Sophia, with a rectangular floor plan under a higher central ceiling crowned by a mighty ornate dome. The dome is supported by 4 arches coming up from the ground floor, while the dome itself is held together by a curious design of 2 sets of 3 wider arches. The 2 sets perfectly overlap one another, meaning that, when we stand directly beneath it, the 6 arches form a star not unlike the Star of David that is present on the modern Israeli flag. While the Israeli state does not exist in the 12th century, the Christian Crusader states barely even exist by this point, the Star of David takes pride of place in Jerusalem, and we may see this motif replicated in other churches and temples across the city. Light spills in from between the arches of this dome, gracefully illuminating the space around us. Looking around the rest of the basilica, we can see many artistic representations of biblical events, surrounded by various carved pieces of stonework showing intricate crosses surrounded by smaller crosses, as well as ornate geometric patterns common to Middle Eastern architecture. These curious crossstones, known as hachkars, are an iconic piece of Armenian tradition and are used to mark important religious locations and events by the Armenian diaspora across the world. A less wholesome part of this church is located to the right of the door as we turn back to it. Displayed in a niche in the wall is a very, very old skull. Legend has it that this is the decapitated head of St. James the Greater, not the one who was the brother of Jesus. This James was executed by Herod Agrippa not long after Jesus' crucifixion. How grim. I imagine he would probably prefer to be reunited with his body, which sits at the far end of the Mediterranean at Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Emerging back out into the sunshine, we continue north and east, circling the wider grounds of the monastery and coming upon the slightly more open city streets of the northern side of the quarter. We can see a greater number of well-dressed and wealthy folk here, walking amongst the varied market streets of the Armenian quarter. However, not everyone here is Armenian in descent. There are a large number of Syrians living here, as well as in other quarters, but they religiously identify more with the Armenians than any others. As we wander past stalls selling hand-woven carpets showing dragons, eagles, and geometric patterns of white, black, orange, red, and green, as well as food vendors offering marinated and barbecued lamb called korovats on a kind of flatbread known as lavash, we see the streets open up ahead around the most important location for Jerusalem's Syrians. Known as St. Mark's Monastery, it follows a more typical cross-shaped floor plan without any fancy dome. Dedicated to St. Mark the Evangelist, who is painted amongst vines on the semicircular lunette above the door, it serves as the seat of the Syrian Orthodox Archbishop of Jerusalem. It was once the house of Miriam, the mother of St. Mark, and by legend housed the Last Supper of Jesus and his apostles. Astute listeners may recall that the Last Supper was also held at the cenacle out on Mount Sion, according to legend. Maybe they had to spread all 120 guests out over 2 locations. Or maybe people just forgot where things happened. After 4 subsequent destructions of the city, it wouldn't be terribly surprising. The church is otherwise a simple one, with pews for the congregation, paintings of biblical events, and a gilded altar behind a velvet veil. It is here that the Pentecost occurred, where the Holy Spirit descended upon the apostles, and where St. Peter escaped from Herod's soldiers. He also apparently left the Virgin Mary here, and since I read those 2 facts in the same sentence in the course of my research, I can only imagine him carrying the aged mother of Jesus, fireman style, through the streets of Jerusalem, while the sounds of pursuing soldiers echo around them. It's a silly image, but it's all I've got to work with. Moving from the Armenian quarter back into the Jewish quarter just to the east, we cross the dual streets of Mount Sion and Arch of Judas that run parallel from the Gate of Sion up to the Latin Exchange, lined on either side by Roman-era colonnades held up by marble columns. These 2 streets not only act as thoroughfares, but also as markets, and as we cross them, we are forced to work our way through dense crowds of merchants and customers dressed in long robes, cloaks, kaftans, and headdresses. These robes, known in Arabic as arba, are the most common form of clothing in the region and provide protection from the sun while keeping the wearer cool. In autumn and winter, thicker kaftans, known as jubba, are worn over the top to defend from the bitter cold of the mountains. Arba and jubba are bound at the waist by a sash, often of silk, and usually coloured in contrast with the robe and kaftan. Because this region, especially along the coast, has easy access to a myriad of dyes, we can see a rainbow of colours in the crowd that surrounds us. White and beige are the plain defaults, alongside sky blue, lime and forest green, pinks and oranges and yellows, and even red and purple, the most expensive of dyes and thus the least common. As we pass these markets by and enter the warren of streets beyond, we quickly come to a building that, surprisingly, is hard to find in Jerusalem, despite it being the ancient home of the Jews. Over the past few decades, Jews were slowly pushed out of the city, but now that Salah al-Din has opened the gates, synagogues are reappearing across the city. This is a particularly prominent one. Known as the Karaite Synagogue, it is home to those Jews who belong to the Karaite sect. Established in the 8th century by Anan ben David, Karaites explicitly follow the words of the written Torah and do not uphold any interpretations made by rabbis, which is in contrast to rabbinic Judaism. The synagogue is old, having been constructed sometime in the 10th century and made from simple clay brick, but its form is typical of other synagogues. The building is square, with a painted dome on top and a trio of 6-pointed stars above the door. Inside, we can see a setup similar to those we found in the churches of the Armenian quarter, seating for the congregation leading up to an altar, which is flanked by a pair of menorahs and has a large panel on the wall behind it covered in Hebrew writing. A pair of columns separate this central space from the cabinets on either side. These cabinets, known as Aron Kodesh, house the Torah scrolls for the synagogue. The entire written Torah, which is the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, is penned onto these enormous scrolls. One scroll, which is kept in its own cabinet, is written on deerskin and is brought out once a year on the special day of Simchat Torah. Exiting this synagogue, we continue on through the dense streets of the Jewish quarter. A short way east is the only church in this part of Jerusalem, that of St. Mary of the Germans. It is a new one, built shortly after the success of the First Crusade by a German pilgrim couple who wished to found a hospice for other pilgrims. It is currently damaged and not in use, as European Christians have only just been permitted back into the city. The husband and wife, coming from the Holy Roman Empire of Germany, Northern Italy, Austria, Czechia, and the Netherlands, chose to build in the Romanesque style, which was popular before Gothic came along later in this century. An octagonal rotunda, crowned by a dome and a cross, act as the entrance, while a 10-metre hall extends out southward to provide space for an altar and a raised pulpit from which a priest can give sermons. Moving north, we travel along the Street of the Germans, so named because of the church we have just visited, and come to the markets. This system of alleyways are populated by dozens of market stalls and more permanent shops that are built into the sides of the buildings that loom over us. The alleys are heavily crowded as people go about buying fish, meat and vegetables, rugs, new clothes, pots and pans, scrolls and books, silk, cotton, beaded necklaces, cups and knives, lamps, vases, barrels of spices from Arabia, India and Southeast Asia, and everything else a citizen of the city may need. Further along to the east, we find the cattle markets, where live animals are brought in from the surrounding countryside to be traded or sold. Goats, cows and chickens are the most common, with pigs being considered unfit for consumption by the current Muslim rulers of the city. The crowds hum with chatter, negotiation and argument in Arabic, Kurdish, Syrian and Hebrew in equal amounts. These markets continue on further west to the Latin Exchange, where we come to 3 parallel souks known as the Street of Cloth Merchants, the Bad Cookery Street, and the Street of Herbs. These were built by Queen Melisende of Jerusalem, the daughter of the second king of Jerusalem, and the grandmother to the last queen to rule prior to the success of Salah al-Din in taking the city. Each of these streets are covered by elegant arched roofs, keeping the market stalls shaded and letting in light only through the slanted windows that add to the warm lanterns interspersed throughout. These souks are home to countless stalls selling, in particular, perfumes, golden jewellery, rolls of fabric, and many cuts of meat, among the usual chaos of clothes, furniture, and civilian weapons, which are primarily short swords, daggers, and axes. This section is also home to what we would call cafes in our modern time, but since coffee wouldn't be discovered for another 300 years, the main drink of choice is tea. Chinese tea is not very widespread at this point, but the North African mint tea and the Arabic style of cardamom tea are a favourite for many locals. More market streets extend southwards, along the Arch of Judas Street, and north towards the Syrian Exchange, but now we should make our way west into the Christian Quarter, or as it was recently known, the Patriarch's Quarter. Almost immediately, opening out from the market stall-filled David Street we are now walking down, we see a small complex of buildings surrounding a church. Built on the sunken remains of a 4th century church, it has 3 hemi-cylindrical apses coming off from the eastern end beneath a golden dome. A longer rectangular hall continues west, where we can find a door, but the interior is much the same as in other churches. This is the Church of St. John the Baptist, and around it are the beginnings of the second most well-known knightly order. In the 11th century, merchants from the Amalfi Coast in Italy acquired the ancient ruins and a chunk of the nearby plaza, and proceeded to build the current church, as well as a hospital and pilgrim hospice, similar to a backpacker's hostel. When the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, this hospital saved the lives of many knights, and to honour this, those knights formed the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. This is quite a mouthful, so they just call themselves the Knights Hospitaller, and they dedicated themselves to protecting pilgrims and offering medical aid across the Holy Land. The hospital is still present, as are the mendicants and pilgrims who serve the public within. As we look across it, we would be surprised to hear it called a hospital. There are certainly no clean surfaces, and only a few enclosed rooms surrounded by slightly more open spaces for more general treatment. It is more of an organised infirmary than anything else. Modern medicine is still a ways off, but these medieval doctors, nurses, and surgeons do their best to ease the suffering of the 1,000 or so afflicted who wander or are carried in through their doors. For those of us who have been in a backpacker's hostel before, the hospice is a lot more familiar. The rooms are cramped and communal, which isn't a worry, as most pilgrims who stay here have little more than the clothes they wear as they walk in. At least they have somewhere to sleep. On the far side of the site, later to be known as Muristan, are two churches dedicated to St. Mary, one with the suffix the Great, the other Latin. Both were controlled by the Hospitallers prior to their departure after Salah al-Din's conquest of the city. Between us and our next destination is an enormous pool of water. Known as Hezekiah's Pool, it was first mentioned in the Book of Kings of the Hebrew Bible, making it a staggering 1900 years old. It serves as a reservoir for drawing water from, and it holds 11 million litres, equivalent to nearly 3 modern swimming pools. It is otherwise known as the Patriarch's Pool due to the nearby residence of Jerusalem's Patriarch, and also as the Pool of Towers, which is suspected to be its original Judean name. As we continue past it, our eyes are drawn forward to the massive walled citadel that sits against the western wall of Jerusalem. Built 13.5 centuries ago, the citadel, known as Mirab Dawood in Arabic and later as the Tower of David, was the last piece of Jerusalem that the Muslims defended during the First Crusade. In fact, they only surrendered it once they were guaranteed passage out of the city. Had they stayed, the First Crusade may well have continued on for a while longer. This citadel is not currently referred to as the Tower of David, as that refers solely to one of its 3 towers, but the name is most likely a misnomer no matter what. Ever since Roman times, no one has been sure of where King David built his citadel, and this was at one point mistaken for Mount Zion. Most likely, the original Zion and the Jebusite fortress David conquered are located to the east. We pass through the gatehouse on the northeastern corner, inspecting the person-sized stone blocks as we do, coming up immediately on the actual Tower of David, an ancient square-based tower that serves as the keep of the castle. 18 metres wide at the base, it tapers as it gets closer to the top, rising up nearly 60 metres. The other 2 towers aren't quite as impressive, but they are more recently refurbished. They feature simple square necks with a wider head, having niches protruding out to give defenders positions from which to fire arrows. In the middle of these 3 towers, the open space of the citadel, which is about 100 metres in either direction, houses the Ayyubid barracks in a building that, once upon a time, was the palace of the Roman governor. Nowadays, it features none of the fine Roman features we are perhaps used to seeing from our tour through that ancient city last episode. Instead, there is an archetypical Middle Eastern house, albeit a much larger one than we might otherwise expect. About the size of a swimming pool, this building is centered on a courtyard that is used as a training ground for the soldiers housed within. Dormitories occupy the rest of the barracks, aside from a sizable mess hall on one side. Some of these soldiers are the elites of the Ayyubid Sultanate, and hail from various places around the region. Their sultan, Salah al-Din, is a Kurdish noble, one of the people who originally lived in northwestern Iran and eastern Turkey as far back as early antiquity. After he took over Egypt from the Shia Fatimid dynasty, he slowly conquered Syria, the Hejaz, Yemen, and finally the inland parts of the Holy Land. As such, the people of his empire, particularly his soldiers, can be Egyptian, Arabic, Syrian, Kurdish, Turkish, Bedouin, or even from regions beyond his direct control, such as North African Berbers, Persians, or Khorasani. These soldiers, tasked with guarding one of the holiest cities in the world, may seem vastly different from one another, but they are united in their cause. And they need to be. While the Third Crusade might be over, there is no telling when another band of overzealous Christians may try to retake Jerusalem, or if the Nizari Ismaili assassins of Masyaf may try to undo the work of the Sunni Muslim Sultan. While Saladin himself currently resides in Damascus, only a year away from dying, his enemies are aware of how important Jerusalem can be in a strategic sense to holding Palestine. Exiting from the citadel, we shall walk northwest along the wall towards a tower that looms up in the distance. We pass the now empty Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem, the extensive palatial building where the ruler of the Catholic Church in Palestine held court before being kicked out by the Ayyubids. The Patriarch himself, Rodolfo, now lives in Acre, with the Queen Isabella and her husband, King Henry. Meanwhile, his street in Jerusalem has been turned into a makeshift market for the farmers in the western countryside. Wheat, barley, rye, scallions, lettuce, turnips, peas, beans, lentils, chickpeas, dates, figs, palm nuts and berries are brought into the city via the nearby Gate of David, known in Arabic as the Gate of Dawood's Mihrab, or prayer room. This gate leads to the road to Jaffa, a coastal city that is an ideal location for Christian pilgrims to sail to on their way to Jerusalem. Further on, after a few leisurely minutes of walking, we come to Tancred's Tower. It is named after the Norman crusader Tancred of Antioch, who breached Jerusalem's walls at this point nearly a century ago. For most people, however, it is known as Goliath's Tower. Its size and its proximity to the Tower of David are likely the reasons for its attribution to David's iconic enemy. It is quite enormous, with a square base 35 meters wide and a height of about 40 meters, a little smaller than that of David, and similarly made from roughly hewn ashlar stones in a tan grey colour. A smaller gate, known as a postern, sits beside it. We climb the stairs, all 150 of them, and emerge once more into the sunshine. This is perhaps one of the highest points in the city, and we have quite the view. Looking west, we can see the land gradually roll down from the mountains to the Mediterranean Sea, and in the opposite direction, the ground falls away to the Dead Sea, the lowest point to be found on land. Before us, the city of Jerusalem stretches out, its chaotic streets and crowded buildings looking like a beige stone carpet, the hubbub of a city's worth of people an incoherent murmur, like a constant background hum that signifies life. However, our eyes lock onto two buildings in particular. Close by is a large basilica with twin domes upon its roof. Known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it is the holiest building in Christianity, and it is purported to stand over the tomb of Jesus. The further building, at the far end of the city, stands in a district all its own, separated from the Muslim and Jewish quarters by a big old wall. Standing roughly 35 meters tall and capped in a dome of bright, shining gold, one would easily mistake the Dome of the Rock for the rising sun. As the third holiest site in Islam, it is a spectacular piece of Islamic architecture. But for now, these two holy cities will have to wait. For one, we need to get back down the stairs of this tower, and that's going to be exhausting. But, more importantly, this episode has gone on for long enough. Thanks for listening to episode 3 of There's a Time and a Place for That. I hope you have enjoyed exploring the southern half of medieval Jerusalem and seeing firsthand what the lives of the people right on the border between the West and the Middle East once looked like. It surely was once a vibrant city, if a little cramped. If you had fun touring this most holy of cities, don't be afraid to send out a call to crusade to your friends and family to listen to this podcast by sharing it on social media. Also, I would love to hear your feedback, so if you have any suggestions of cities to visit, or just want to let me know which parts you enjoy most of all, feel free to leave a comment. If you enjoyed exploring medieval Jerusalem, you might also enjoy reading Till Time. The book series follows best friends Imogen and Ashton as they adventure through the past, just as we are doing, though with a little more action. The Sultan's Siege, the first book of the series, recounts the discovery of their time-traveling abilities and their exciting fight to escape the war between Crusaders and Ayyubids and make it back home, taking place only 80 kilometers southeast of Jerusalem and 9 years before our tour. You may even get to meet the legendary Salah al-Din at one point. The sequel, The Frankish Feud, follows their dive into Carolingian Francia and their quest alongside a royal assassin to end a plot that threatens to upturn European history. More books are on their way, but for now, you can find these first 2 installments on Apple Books, Google Books, Amazon Kindle, Kobo, and Barnes & Noble. Links to all of these can be found through the link tree in the description of this podcast. Thank you for listening to There's a Time and a Place for That, On Hallowed Ground, Part 1, and I'll see you next time.